They say water never lies, but in some U.S. national parks it hides people in a way that makes no sense to rescuers, investigators, or even the people who were standing just a few feet away when it happened. Every year, visitors disappear around rivers and lakes. Most of those cases have explanations: strong currents, cold shock, a slip on wet rock. But the cases we're starting with today don't fit the usual patterns. Clear weather, shallow water, multiple witnesses, calm conditions. And still the person is gone before anyone even understands what they're looking at. Search teams expect difficult recoveries in the wilderness. They do not expect clean riverbeds, untouched sand, no drag marks, no snagged clothing, and no sign the person ever entered deep water. They do not expect sonar sweeps to come back flat. They do not expect divers to report perfect visibility with nothing to find. And they definitely do not expect search dogs to follow a trail right up to the shoreline. And just stop. These disappearances connected to water leave investigators with almost nothing to work with. And that's when the stories start to overlap with each other, in small ways people don't like to talk about. Pauses, gaps, seconds where everyone looked away. The first case begins during what should have been the safest part of a river trip. A large group was rafting a slow stretch of water inside a national park. Calm river, warm day, wide shoreline, no hazards. They pulled their rafts to a sandy bend to cool off and swim. Several people, including 2 women in bikinis, waded out to where the water barely reached their waists. Everything was loud, normal, social. Other rafters watched from the bank, talking, eating snacks, checking their phones. One of the girls, around her mid-20s, stepped out of the water last. Someone even laughed and said she was always the last one to finish swimming. She squeezed water from her hair, walked toward the others, and stood with the group for a moment. Multiple people confirmed seeing her on the sand, maybe 2 or 3 steps from her friends, and then the group started gathering their gear, tying coolers back down, sorting paddles. It wasn't chaotic. No one wandered off. No one shouted that someone had walked away. But when one of the friends called her name, she didn't answer. At first, they assumed she was standing behind someone else. Then they spread out a little, checking the trees, the shore, the rafts. Within 90 seconds, the mood changed. People started running along the sandbar, scanning the water, the bushes, even the footprints. They called her name over and over. Someone jumped back into the river, trying to see if she'd slipped or gone back in for a quick swim. But the bottom was firm, visibility was perfect, and the current was weak. There was nowhere for her to disappear to. Rangers arrived fast. The search began with a full sweep of the riverbend. Divers went in. The riverbed was smooth and empty. No sign she'd fallen or been pulled under. No disturbed silt. No snag points. Nothing. Helicopters scanned both banks. Dogs followed her track from the rafts to the sand. And then it just ended, as if she had taken her last step exactly where witnesses said she'd been standing. Searchers expected at least one clue. Something. Instead, they got the same outcome that shows up again and again in these water-related disappearances. Nothing to explain the moment where someone was right there, visible to everyone, and the next moment, they simply weren't. The search for her continued long after sunset. Rangers expanded the grid outward from the sandbar, checking both sides of the river for almost a mile. They marked every possible entry and exit point, even ones that didn't make sense. Some rescuers walked chest-deep through the water, dragging long poles, hoping to feel clothing, hair, or anything that shouldn't be there. Nothing turned up. The divers went in again the next morning. The river was still clear, the current still weak. They traced every contour of the bottom, even the deeper drop-offs farther downstream. The team reported the same thing over and over: undisturbed sand and rock, no drag lines, no sign of a fall, no footprints beyond what the group had made earlier. It was as if she hadn't touched the water at all after stepping out the first time. When the search shifted to the shoreline, rangers found a detail they couldn't explain. On the sand, right where she had stood, there was a single line of deeper impressions. Not footprints, not animal prints, but a kind of straight pressure mark, like something heavy had briefly pushed down into the surface and then lifted away. It didn't match any gear the group carried, and it didn't lead anywhere. The mark didn't continue toward the forest or the water. It just existed in one spot and then stopped. A few searchers mentioned it quietly, but the official logs didn't include it. The case was suspended after several days. No body, no personal items, no evidence of a struggle. She was simply gone. The group eventually left the park, still convinced she had been standing right next to them when she vanished. Water cases in these parks tend to share these strange gaps, the moment where the story breaks, and the next expected step never appears. And the next case brings the same kind of gap, but in a place with far fewer people around to witness it. This second disappearance happened at Lake Tahoe, on a calm afternoon when visibility was so good you could see the rocks under the surface from 20 feet out. A group of teenagers were swimming near the shore. One of them, a 17-year-old, kept glancing across the lake toward a quiet stretch with no boats, no swimmers, and no trails nearby. He told his friends he thought he saw someone standing in the distance, but no one else noticed anything. He walked into the water again, only up to his waist at first, then farther out. His friends assumed he was just cooling off or trying to get a better view of something on the water. They were talking, splashing, not paying close attention, but when they looked back, he wasn't there. At first they thought he'd ducked under and come up somewhere else. Tahoe has cold pockets that can shock swimmers, so they shouted his name and scanned the surface. When he didn't appear after several seconds, panic set in. One of them ran to a rental kiosk for help, while the others searched the shoreline and deeper water. Rescuers arrived quickly. They used paddleboards, kayaks, and a boat equipped with basic sonar. Nothing showed up. Divers entered a few hours later when the sun was higher and visibility was better. They focused on the exact point where he had last been seen and the area around it. The lake bottom was clear, smooth, and empty. No fresh disturbances, no clothing, no personal items. Nothing caught on the rocks. What worried rescuers most was the direction of his last steps. According to the footprints in the wet sand, he had been moving out into the water in a straight line. But the trail didn't end at the drop-off where the bottom gets dark and deep. It ended a few feet before that, on a flat stretch where the water was barely chest deep. After that, no bubbles, no movement, no sound. Just a clean break in the story. The parents later asked if cold shock or a sudden cramp could explain it. Rangers said the conditions didn't support that. He had been in that depth many times. The water there was calm, no sudden currents, and if he'd gone under, the divers would have found something. But they didn't. Nothing at all. And this wasn't the only time searchers walked away from a lake or river with the same unanswered question. How does a person disappear in full daylight, in clear water, with no sign that anything happened? Search teams don't like cases where the water is calm, the visibility is good, and there are multiple witnesses. Those are the situations where they expect quick results. But the Tahoe case forced them to widen the search far beyond what made sense. Boats scanned deeper sections of the lake. Dive teams went down the steep shelf several times. Nothing. Even the dogs brought to the shoreline picked up a short trail along the sand, and then stopped at the exact point where his footprints had ended. A ranger later said the same thing as in the river case. It's like the trail just shuts off. No drift patterns, no signs of someone struggling, no belongings floating up later. Just a clean stop. That same week, another park documented a disappearance near water, this time in Glacier National Park, and this case confused search teams even more because the man wasn't a swimmer. He was an experienced angler who knew that river inside and out. He had set up on a rocky ledge overlooking a calm bend. The last confirmed sighting came from a couple hiking the opposite bank. They said he looked like he was examining something beneath the surface, leaning forward, but not dangerously close to falling. They waved to him. He waved back. Everything appeared completely normal. About 20 minutes later, another group of hikers passed the same spot and found his fishing gear still there, rod resting against a rock, tackle box half open, lunch untouched. The only thing missing was him. The river below was shallow at that spot, with clear visibility and barely any movement. If he'd slipped, the hikers should have heard it, or at least seen disturbed water. Rangers started a search immediately. They checked the rocks for slip marks or broken moss. Nothing. The rock surface was dry. The water below showed no signs of someone falling in. No stirred sediment, no swirl line, no bubbles, nothing. The riverbed itself was checked multiple times. Flat, clean, empty. A diver later mentioned something strange off-record. In a deeper pocket farther downstream, a place where the missing man shouldn't have been able to reach without swimming against the current, they found a single lure stuck in a crack in the rock. It was the same brand he used, but the hook was straightened, not by force, but smoothly bent, as if pulled from an odd angle. They photographed it, logged it, and moved on. It didn't help the case. Search dogs traced his scent to the ledge and then down toward the waterline. But again, the scent just ended, almost like the person had stepped into air instead of water. They tried the opposite bank. Nothing. And this wasn't an isolated event. Water cases often include a point where the trail ends sharply, not gradually, not faded, ended. One of the most unusual of these water-linked disappearances came from Yellowstone, near a hydrothermal area where swimming isn't recommended, but still happens in the cooler runoff streams. A group of adults had been waiting in one of those safe zones, where the temperatures mix and become tolerable. There were at least 10 witnesses. A woman in her 40s stood in the shallows talking with a friend, water barely reaching her knees. Steam drifted across the surface in thin sheets, but visibility was clear. Her friend turned away to grab a towel from a nearby rock. When she turned back, the woman was no longer standing in the water. There was no splash, no cry, no sudden disturbance, just empty space. The friend shouted her name. Others nearby looked over immediately. Some thought she'd crouched behind a rock or slipped on algae, but the water was clear enough that they could see the bottom. Nothing was there. Rangers arrived and cordoned off the area. They checked the nearby runoff channels, all too shallow. They checked the hotter thermal pools. No trace of clothing, fabric, or skin contact indicators that usually appear when someone enters a dangerous zone. Even the thermal bacteria mats were undisturbed. One ranger later said something that stuck with the search crew. If she stepped into the hotter water by accident, we would have known. Those pools always show it. But there was no sign at all. It's like she wasn't here. Cases like these pull investigators into long nights of searching, reviewing maps, and questioning witnesses again and again. And each time, the same problem shows up. The missing person should be somewhere, but they aren't. And the next disappearance takes that same sense of confusion and places it next to one of the clearest bodies of water in the country, where people expected answers and found the opposite. Crater Lake is one of the clearest, calmest bodies of water in the United States. Rangers rely on that clarity. When someone goes missing near the shoreline, the expectation is simple. The lake gives up answers fast. But not in the case that happened late one afternoon, near a viewpoint where the water drops straight down into blue depth. A woman in her 30s was sitting on a fallen log only a few feet from the shoreline. She wasn't swimming. She wasn't climbing. She wasn't alone. Her companion said she'd been talking about how still the water looked, almost like glass. At one point, she leaned forward slightly, squinting, and said something like, "Do you see that?" He assumed she meant a reflection or a fish near the surface. He turned away for less than 30 seconds while scrolling through photos on his phone. When he looked up again, the log was empty. At first, he thought she'd stepped behind one of the nearby trees, but she didn't answer when he called. He circled the area, expecting to see her on the trail. Nothing. Rangers responded within an hour. They examined the log, completely dry, no drag marks, no indication of someone slipping. The ground around it was undisturbed. The drop-off behind it makes noise when anything falls in. That's what confused searchers. They heard nothing. A dive team deployed the next morning. Visibility was excellent, one of the best days of the season. They expected to see fabric or something lodged along the rock shelves. They found nothing. No silt clouds, no disrupted algae, no indication anyone had entered the water recently. If she had fallen, someone should have heard it, or at least seen the water break. But the surface had been calm and smooth. On their third sweep, one diver reported seeing something unusual. A perfectly vertical column of colder water, rising from deeper than the normal thermocline. It wasn't a hazard, just strange. It looked like a shimmering distortion, like heat above asphalt, but underwater. The moment he tried to move toward it, the distortion faded. When he returned to the exact spot minutes later, it wasn't there. The team noted it, but couldn't explain it. They moved on. Search dogs brought to the shoreline tracked the woman's scent in a short loop around the log, then out toward the edge. And that's where it stopped. Completely. Not faded, not drifting. Stopped. Rangers don't like those scent cuts. They show up in a handful of water cases each year, but very rarely at Crater Lake. The search lasted 5 days, with boats, dives, shoreline sweeps, and aerial passes. Nothing was recovered. Her companion insisted she had been right there, sitting, relaxed, in full daylight. There was no place to go. Steep walls on both sides, open visibility for hundreds of feet. And still, she was simply no longer present. Another case, with a similar abrupt break, happened miles away in Olympic National Park, near a waterfall that visitors often swim beneath during summer. The rocks there form natural pockets where the water flows behind them. It's not a place where someone can hide or exit without being seen. A young woman stepped behind the curtain of water for a moment while her friends filmed on their phones. It was shallow, safe, and clear. She didn't come back out. At first, her friends thought she was playing around or avoiding the camera. They called her name, laughing at first, then confused, then panicked. The pool under the fall is only a few feet deep. The water is cold, but not dangerous. Rangers arrived and checked the rock pockets one by one. There was no way through to the woods. The rocks formed a complete barrier. She couldn't have climbed over them without making noise or splashing. Divers entered even though the depth didn't require them. They checked every gap. Nothing. One diver said the water behind the rocks felt unnaturally still, as if the current hesitated there. But nothing was found. In the end, the pattern repeated again. Last seen standing in shallow water, full visibility, and gone before anyone realized anything was happening. These water-related disappearances come from different parks, different environments, and different people. Yet they share the same quiet, sudden moment where something breaks in the story. A moment where someone should still be visible, traceable, or recoverable, but isn't. The next disappearance happened in a section of Yellowstone where cold runoff streams pass close to geothermal vents. It's an area visitors usually treat with extra caution because the ground can shift temperature within a few feet. But there are stretches where people do step into the cooler water to sit, relax, or wash off trail dust. Rangers warn visitors not to wander too close to the hotter zones, but the boundaries aren't always obvious. A man in his late 20s was with 2 friends. They had been hiking all morning and decided to rest near one of the mixing zones where warm and cold water form a shallow, slow-moving pool. Plenty of others had been in the same spot earlier that day. It wasn't considered dangerous. He sat down in the water, facing slightly upstream, letting the warm current hit his legs. His friends were only a few feet away, talking, unpacking snacks, trying to get their phones to reconnect. One of them said he'd joked about the water being weirdly quiet, but nothing about his behavior seemed unusual or tense. At one point, he leaned forward, placing his hands on the sand under the surface, and looked down as if he'd noticed something on the bottom. Maybe a smooth stone, or a reflection. His friends weren't paying close attention. One of them said he thought the man was trying to trace something with his fingers in the water. 30 seconds passed. Then another friend asked him something, and he didn't answer. When they looked over, he wasn't sitting there anymore. At first, they assumed he'd stood up and walked toward the bank behind them. But the spot was shallow enough that walking would have made noise and ripples. The surface was calm, and the sand where he had been sitting was completely undisturbed. His water bottle still sat next to him, half empty, placed upright. The friends called his name, walked up and down the bank, then checked behind a group of boulders just off the shore. Nothing. Panic set in fast. One of them ran toward the trail to get help. A ranger arrived within minutes. Searchers marked the entire pool and the connecting channel. The water depth was barely to an adult's waist. They expected a fast recovery, even if he'd slipped. The bottom was clean sand and smooth mineral deposits. Any movement leaves obvious patterns. But when divers entered, they found the bottom perfectly flat. When he stirred the water with a pole, the temperature difference vanished instantly, like it had been wiped clean. Search dogs brought in later followed the man's scent from the trail to the edge of the pool, then halfway across the shallow area, and then the trail ended abruptly where he had been sitting. They circled, but never picked up a continuation of the scent. Not toward the woods, not down the channel, not upstream. His friends kept insisting the same key detail. He had been sitting upright, visible, calm, in clear water that didn't even reach his chest. There was no splash, no sound, no sudden movement. One moment he was there. The next moment, he wasn't. Investigators kept returning to this case because it didn't match the usual patterns. People slip on rocks. They get pulled by currents. They dive into cold pockets. But none of that explains a still pool with a flat bottom, perfect visibility, and no physical trace to follow. And the same problem appears again in one of the strangest disappearances tied to water. This time, not in a river or lake, but near a cave system where an underground stream runs through rock channels that shouldn't be accessible at all. The cave system in this next case isn't large, and it isn't deep. Rangers describe it as more of a rock overhang with a narrow channel where an underground stream resurfaces for a short distance before disappearing back under layers of stone. It's not a place anyone can physically enter. The space is too tight. The water moves through a gap that's barely wide enough for an arm. But the spot attracts hikers because of the sound, a low, constant hum coming from inside the rock, created by water pressure and echo. Most people find it calming. A man in his early 40s was hiking with his adult daughter. They stopped near the cave opening to rest and cool off. He walked closer to the edge to look at the water emerging from beneath the rock. His daughter stayed back on the trail, checking their route. She said he was talking normally, pointing at something, possibly a pattern in the flow. There was nothing unusual in his voice or posture. He knelt down, touched the shallow stream, and leaned forward slightly as if listening. She remembered him saying, "It sounds different right here," but she didn't think much about it. He often commented on small environmental details. When she looked down at her map for a few seconds and then looked back up, he wasn't kneeling anymore. The area around the cave is open. There's no dense brush, no hidden drop-offs, and no alternate trail he could have taken without passing directly in front of her. The only place he could have moved was back along the stream or toward her, but both paths were in her line of sight. At first, she assumed he'd stood up and walked behind her, but when she turned around, the trail was empty. She called his name. No answer. She walked the perimeter of the clearing, then down the path, then checked the rocks around the cave entrance. Nothing. The stream was too shallow for a person to fully submerge or even disappear under. It only reached a few inches deep before sliding into the narrow rock slit. Rangers confirmed immediately that no grown adult could physically fit into that gap. They attempted to insert a camera probe into the stream's exit point, but the angle and shape blocked it after only a few feet. Search teams marked a wide grid and started working outward. They found no sign of forced movement, no footprints leading away, no broken foliage. Tracking dogs followed his scent directly to the spot where he had been kneeling. And then, the trail ended. They searched along the cave wall, up the ridge, and both directions of the trail. The scent never picked up again. Later that afternoon, a team used thermal cameras near the cave opening, hoping to detect a heat signature if he was nearby, but hidden by rock. Instead, they picked up something else. A sudden cold patch just above the stream surface, about the size of a basketball, which faded as soon as they moved closer. It wasn't recorded as evidence because it couldn't be replicated, but several rescuers noted it in their personal logs. By the third day, search patterns had expanded far beyond the logical radius. They checked the stream's path above and below the cave, even though physically he couldn't have passed through the stone channel. Teams rappelled down the slope on the far side and scanned with drones. Nothing. No clothing. No equipment. No prints. No trace. His daughter kept repeating the same detail. He had been right there, kneeling at the water, speaking normally. She heard no splash, no slip, no sudden movement. There wasn't even a gap of time long enough for him to disappear down a trail. The incident report ended with a single line that stands out in cases like this. Subject last seen in full visibility. No direction of travel established. And the next disappearance moves us back to a more open environment. A wide riverbank, where a moment of distraction turned into a search that still has no clear explanation, even after tracing more than 10 miles of shoreline. The next disappearance happened on a wide riverbank inside a national park, where visibility should have made the search easy. The river there spreads out before narrowing again downstream, creating long sections of shallow, slow-moving water. Families often stop to rest, skim stones, or let kids wade in the shallows. It's one of the last places search teams expect a clean break in someone's trail. A family of 4 had been eating lunch near the river's edge. The father and older son were setting up fishing lines, while the mother sat on a folding blanket with the younger boy, who was 6. They'd been there for almost an hour, talking casually, watching kayakers pass. Nothing unusual. The boy walked to the water several times to toss small rocks, never more than a few steps from the bank. At one point he asked if he could go pick up one more rock, and his mother said yes. He walked down the same gentle slope he'd gone down all afternoon. The distance from the blanket to the waterline was maybe 12 feet. No bushes, no obstructions, no blind spots. His mother watched him until he crouched near the edge. Then she turned her head toward her husband to ask a question. When she looked back, he wasn't there. She called his name once, then louder. Her husband and older son ran down the slope, scanning both directions. The river was calm, clear enough to see the bottom in the first few feet. If he'd slipped, they would have seen splashing, bubbles, or at least a ripple pattern. But the surface was flat and undisturbed. Within minutes, other visitors joined the search. Someone ran for a ranger. The mother kept saying the same sentence over and over. He was right there. I saw him crouching. He didn't go in. Rangers arrived and immediately started a shoreline search. They noted the boy's footprints leading down the slope, the small indent where he had crouched. And then, nothing. No prints leading away. No slide marks. No disturbed mud. No sign of someone walking into or out of deeper water. The riverbed showed no fresh clouding, no kicked-up sediment. They brought dogs within the hour. The dogs followed his scent down the slope, to the waterline. And then the scent stopped exactly where the mother had last seen him. They circled repeatedly, noses down, pulling handlers in confused loops. But the trail never continued in any direction. Searchers fanned out downstream, following the river's natural pull, even though no current strong enough to carry a child existed in that section. Volunteers walked waist-deep through long stretches of water, dragging pole sets, checking every pocket and drop. Helicopters flew grid passes along both banks. Kayakers were stopped and questioned. Nobody had seen anything. By evening, rescue teams introduced sonar. They mapped the slower, wider areas where debris usually collects. The scans came back clear. They ran them again at sunrise to eliminate noise. Same result. Flat readings. No anomalies. A diver who'd worked many water recoveries said the same thing several others had said in similar cases. If he went into that water, there would be something. Sand shifts, plants bend, silt rises, something changes. But it's like nothing happened at all. The family stayed on site for days, walking the banks themselves, calling his name into the quiet sections where the river bends. Rangers widened the search radius to include the woods, the trails, even distant campgrounds, even though none of those paths explained the missing footprints. In the end, the official report listed the same uncomfortable phrase that has shown up in many of these water-linked disappearances. Last known location confirmed. No direction of travel. This case forced investigators to rethink the assumption that calm water equals simple recovery. And it mirrored another disappearance in a different park. One where a swimmer walked out of a lake during broad daylight, spoke to people on shore, and then vanished between one breath and the next. The next disappearance didn't happen in deep water or fast current. It happened at a lake known for clear visibility and a long, gentle shoreline where people routinely stand waist-deep without any danger. Rangers described the spot as one of the lowest-risk areas in the entire park. That's why the disappearance stood out immediately. A group of friends in their early 20s had spent most of the day swimming and lying on the warm rocks along the shore. People around them were paddleboarding, laughing, grilling, typical weekend noise. One of the girls had just come out of the water and stood near the edge, brushing her hair back, speaking casually to two friends. Several witnesses remembered the moment because she'd been laughing about how cold the water felt. She stepped up onto a flat rock, maybe 10 feet from the lake's edge, and sat briefly to adjust her sandals. Her friends were right there, one on a towel, one packing a cooler. They said she wasn't acting strange, tired, or confused. She wasn't cold. She wasn't intoxicated. She wasn't alone. Then, for reasons no one has been able to explain, she stood up and took a few slow steps back toward the water, almost like she was going to wash her hands or rinse sand from her legs. Her friends saw her walk down the small slope. Nothing unusual. But what happened next is the break everyone keeps repeating. One friend looked up from her bag and saw the girl mid-stride, ankle-deep in the water. The same friend looked down again for a second, 1 or 2 seconds at most, because something had spilled in the cooler. When she looked up, the girl was gone. At first, she thought the girl had dropped below the surface as a joke, but the water there is shallow. Even kneeling would leave her head above the surface. Another friend thought she'd waded to the right, toward a group of paddleboarders, but nobody there had seen her. Within 30 seconds, both friends were shouting her name. People nearby stopped what they were doing and scanned the shoreline. Someone called for a ranger immediately. Rangers arrived and began by checking the shallow area first, walking in a line, shoulder to shoulder. The lakebed was smooth, visible, undisturbed. No kicked-up sand, no drag marks, no sudden drop-off. Visibility extended several yards out. If she had gone under, rescuers would have seen her instantly. Dive teams came next, focusing on the deeper shelf farther out, even though every witness insisted she hadn't walked anywhere near it. The divers found nothing. No fabric caught on rocks, no footprints in the silt, no signs of entry. Then came the detail that bothered the search leaders. A single isolated footprint found on a rock several feet away from where she'd been standing. It was faint, wet, and facing the wrong direction, toward the lake rather than away from it. The rock had a dry patch around it, suggesting the print didn't come from someone walking normally. Some searchers believed it wasn't hers. Others weren't so sure. Dogs brought in later followed her scent down the slope toward the lake, paused, circled twice, and then stopped the trail entirely at the exact point where the friend had last seen her. There was no continuation up the shore or into the woods. It was another scent, dead end. The searches lasted 5 days. Rangers expanded outward along the shoreline for miles in both directions. Boats scanned the lake repeatedly. No belongings washed up. No paddleboarder saw movement. No screams were reported. No splash. No ripples. The official summary said the same thing as the River and Tahoe cases. Subject disappeared in full daylight, with multiple witnesses. No evidence of entry into deeper water. No discoverable direction of travel. This case raised questions inside the search team itself, and it wasn't the only one from that season. Another disappearance happened not far from Volcanic Springs, where a swimmer walked up the shore, spoke clearly to a group, and then vanished during a routine shoreline check. That one left rescuers even more unsettled. The disappearance near the Volcanic Springs happened late in the afternoon, when most visitors were starting to pack up. The area wasn't part of an active geothermal field, but it sat close enough to vents and old lava tubes that the ground temperature changed depending on where you stepped. Rangers warned people not to wander too far from the marked shoreline, but the shallow basin itself was considered safe. Locals swam there every summer. A mixed group of hikers had stopped to cool off in the water. One man, around 30, had been floating near the shore, periodically standing up to talk with people sitting on the rocks. He wasn't alone. He wasn't tired. He wasn't cold. Multiple witnesses said he was completely normal, laughing, alert, making plans for dinner later. He eventually walked up onto the rocky shore, dripping wet, and stood near a cluster of backpacks. He talked to a woman in the group for almost a minute about which trail they should take back. Then he turned, looking toward the water again, as if he'd noticed something, and stepped down 2 small rocks toward the edge. He wasn't far. He wasn't out of sight. The slope was open and smooth, with no trees or blind corners. A group of teenagers sitting a few yards away watched him walk. One of them remembered that he paused at the edge, like he was about to say something, but then didn't. He just stood there, looking at the surface. Then one teen turned his head to answer a friend's question. When he looked back, 5 seconds later, the man was gone. At first, they assumed he'd stepped behind a nearby boulder or gone to retrieve something from his pack. But the woman he'd been talking to earlier realized he hadn't walked past her. She hadn't taken her eyes off the trail area behind them. He wasn't there. They checked the shoreline, checked behind the rocks, checked the water. Nothing. When the rangers arrived, they interviewed everyone separately. All witnesses agreed on the same sequence. He stepped down the slope, stood near the water, paused, and then nothing. No splash, no startled reaction, no slipping sound on wet stone. Just a missing person. Rescuers entered the water immediately. The bottom was a mix of gravel and warm sand. Disturbances show up easily there. The team expected to see a collapse pattern or scuffed stones. There were none. They extended the search outward, marking each diver's path. The water wasn't deep enough to hide someone without signs of entry. They checked the channels where the water flowed in and out. Both were shallow. Both were checked by hand and with cameras. Nothing. During the shoreline sweep, rangers found a detail that stayed with many of them. A dry patch on one of the rocks where a wet footprint should have been. If the man had stepped there on the way down, the stone should have shown moisture. Instead, it was completely dry, as if nobody had stepped on it at all. Dogs were brought in. They picked up his scent on the upper rocks, followed it down the slope, and then stopped in the exact spot where the teenagers had seen him last. They circled, pulled handlers in slow loops, then gave up the trail. Helicopters scanned outward toward the tree line, even though no witness recalled seeing him leave the basin. Rangers even checked old lava tubes nearby, not because he could have entered one, the openings are too narrow, but because they needed to rule out the area. Nothing turned up. The search continued for 3 days. No clothing, no debris, no tracks. No noise recordings. No disturbed sand. The water never turned cloudy. The rocks never shifted. It was another clean break. One ranger described the scene in a way that perfectly matched several of the earlier cases. It looked like somebody erased the moment after he took his last step. The resemblance to the other water-related disappearances wasn't lost on the search team. A person visible to multiple witnesses steps toward the shoreline, not into danger, not into deep water, and then simply stops being part of the environment. And the next case would push things even further, involving a spot known for strong visibility, predictable currents, and an entire campsite that became part of the search. The next disappearance happened near a river campground where the currents are predictable, and the shoreline is wide enough that most rangers consider it one of the safer areas in the entire park. People fish there, families camp along the bank, and during summer the water never gets high enough to create unexpected hazards. It's the kind of place where search teams expect straightforward answers. A group of campers had been staying in the same spot for 2 nights. They weren't new to the outdoors. They'd fished the river earlier that morning, walked the trails, cooked over the fire. Everything about their stay was routine. One man in the group, in his mid-30s, decided to rinse off at the edge of the river before dinner. Not swim, just wash his hands and face, maybe cool down after setting up gear. He walked down the short slope to the water. His friends were only a few yards behind him, sorting firewood and talking about their plan for the next day. They could see him clearly. He wasn't far, and the water was shallow enough that small stones beneath the surface were visible. One of the men called out a joke, and the missing man turned his head to respond. He smiled, bent down, and splashed water onto his face. He stood up again, wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, then took a half step forward as if he wanted to rinse his arms too. That was the last moment anyone saw him. When his friends looked back, this time after only a few seconds, he wasn't at the shoreline anymore. One of them assumed he'd walked back toward camp, but he wasn't there. Another thought he'd stepped to the left behind the fire pit. But the ground was open. No brush, no trees close enough to hide behind, no boulders, no blind spots. They walked the area first, then ran it. The man's hat was still on the rock where he'd set it down. His shoes were still on his feet before he disappeared. There were no extra footprints suggesting he'd walked off. The water was clear, calm, undisturbed. When they shouted his name, other campers came over to help. Everyone started spreading out along the shore. Within minutes, a ranger was notified, and the first response team arrived shortly after. Searchers checked the slope down to the water. No slip marks, no churned sand. Rangers asked the friends to show the exact spot where they'd last seen him. The water there was knee-deep at most, with no sudden drop-offs. Divers still entered to be certain. They traced the bottom by hand, checking every crack between the stones. Nothing. They moved farther out, sweeping toward deeper water, even though no witness believed he'd gone that far. Sonar boats scanned the entire bend of the river. Clean readings. No objects. No movement. No indication anyone had entered the current recently. Then came the detail that bothered investigators. A section of the riverbed about 10 feet downstream, where the gravel showed a pattern that looked like it had been disturbed, just slightly, like something had pressed against it from above. But the pattern stopped abruptly in a straight line, almost like half the disturbance was missing. It didn't match a footstep or an animal. It didn't match drift from current. It didn't match gear. Rangers took photos, reviewed them, and still couldn't categorize it. Search dogs were brought in next. They followed the man's scent directly from camp to the shoreline. The path was clear, normal, consistent. The dogs responded strongly until the exact point where he had bent down to splash water on his face. After that, they lost the scent completely. Not a fade, not a drift, just a stop. They tried both banks. Nothing. By nightfall, the search had expanded far beyond the logical radius. Crews checked upstream and downstream, even though both directions were unrealistic. They combed the woods around camp, even though no one had seen or heard anything. They returned at dawn and repeated the process. Nothing had changed. The river was still clear, still slow, still quiet. He had been visible, upright, balanced, in calm water, within hearing range and sight range of multiple people. And in a matter of seconds, he was gone. Cases like this are the ones that shift from recovery to investigation far too soon. And the next disappearance would take place at another campsite, but this time involving an early morning fisherman, a perfect shoreline vantage point, and a single detail found in the water that made no practical sense to anyone who saw it. The next disappearance happened at a lakeside campsite just after sunrise, the kind of quiet morning where sound travels far and the water looks like a sheet of glass. A man in his late 50s, an experienced fisherman, had camped there with his brother. They'd fished the same spot for years. It wasn't remote, and it wasn't dangerous. The lake bottom near shore was solid, the drop-off gentle, and the conditions were calm enough that you could see reflected pine trees perfectly. He woke early, made coffee, and told his brother he was going to cast a few lines before the rest of the campers were up. His brother watched him walk down the gentle slope toward the water, carrying only a small tackle pouch and his rod. The sun hadn't fully risen yet, but visibility was excellent. There were no other tents between them, no brush blocking the view, no wind, no fog. The man stood at the shoreline, looking out across the lake. Then he moved a few steps to the right, where a flat rock gave a better casting angle. His brother remembered him turning slightly, adjusting the reel, and then glancing down at the water as if something caught his eye. Not alarmed, just focused. The brother turned away for a moment to move their stove off the ground. It couldn't have taken more than 5 seconds. When he looked back, the fisherman wasn't on the rock anymore. At first he assumed his brother had stepped a few feet to the side, maybe to untangle a knot or look for better footing. But the rock surface was empty. He called his name. No answer. He walked down the slope, then jogged. The fisherman was nowhere in sight. Not to the left, not to the right, not in the water. The brother shouted for nearby campers. People came quickly. Within minutes, rangers were alerted. The shoreline showed the man's footprints leading from the tent to the water. That was it. No footprints leading back, no slide marks, no evidence of someone losing balance, and the water was still perfectly flat. If he'd fallen in, there would have been a visible disturbance. Even a small splash sends ripples across that part of the lake. Rangers examined the rock. Dry, no scuffing, no scrapes, no algae smear. Nothing to show he'd slipped or stepped off its edge. Divers were deployed mid-morning. They started right at the rock platform, expecting to find something obvious. Snagged clothing, a hat, the rod. Instead, they found one confusing detail. A lure, the same brand the fisherman used, floating beneath the surface in a place that didn't match the cast angle. It hovered near a vertical rock wall underwater, attached to nothing, like it had drifted there without tension. One diver said the line looked too straight for a natural fall, as if it had been pulled taut and then released in the wrong direction. But that didn't explain how the man vanished without any surface disturbance. Searchers performed a shoreline drag, then a wider dive sweep. They found no snag points, no abrupt drop-offs, no sediment fans, no torn vegetation. The lake bottom looked untouched. Water rescue teams repeated the sweep from multiple angles, grid after grid. Nothing. Search dogs tracked the man's scent from the tent to the rock. The scent cut sharply at the exact point where the brother had last seen him. There was no continuation into the woods, no trail around the campsite, no drift along the waterline. By the second day, helicopters scanned the perimeter of the lake. Rangers checked the trailheads, the restrooms, the roadways. They interviewed every camper within a quarter-mile radius. No one saw or heard anything. The fisherman never shouted, never splashed, never walked away. One ranger admitted later that the silence bothered him most. He said, "You don't disappear off a rock in 3 seconds without noise." This was another case where the environment worked against any obvious explanation. Calm water, perfect visibility, multiple witnesses, no hazards, no blind spots, no signs of distress. And yet the man was simply no longer there. The disappearance near the waterfall happened on a warm afternoon, when the basin was crowded enough that rangers expected witnesses for everything: slips, jumps, even minor injuries. The sound of the falls was loud but steady, and visibility around the shoreline was open. People sat on rocks, took photos, and cooled their feet in the water. Nothing about the environment seemed dangerous. A man in his early 30s had been hiking with two friends. They reached the waterfall and decided to rest. The basin was shallow for several feet before dropping off into a smooth, bowl-like shape, carved by the falls over time. The man waded in up to his knees, then stepped farther out to where the water reached his thighs. His friends stayed near the edge, watching him. He turned toward them, said something about how cold the water was, and then took another step, angling his head like he was trying to listen through the noise of the falls. One of the friends joked that he was trying to hear the bottom talking. The man smiled, glanced back at the waterfall, then took one more slow step toward the deeper part. That's when both friends looked away, for only a moment. One bent down to grab a water bottle. The other adjusted his backpack. They weren't distracted for long, 5 seconds at most. When they looked up, he wasn't standing where he had been a moment earlier. At first, they assumed he'd ducked below the surface, maybe splashing water on his face. But the water was too shallow for that. Even crouching would have left half his torso visible, and they didn't see any movement, bubbles, or distortion on the surface. They called his name and stepped into the water themselves. Other visitors noticed the sudden panic and alerted a ranger who happened to be nearby. Within minutes, people were scanning the shoreline, walking the perimeter, checking behind boulders and logs. Rangers arrived and immediately ordered a basin sweep. The water was clear, with sunlight hitting the bottom. They expected to see something: clothing, silt movement, anything. Instead, the bottom looked untouched. Divers entered and performed a circular search pattern. Nothing showed up. The first confusing detail appeared when a diver surfaced holding a single item: a small smooth stone with a faint spiral groove cut into it. It wasn't sharp, it didn't look man-made, and it didn't match the surrounding rock. The diver found it wedged in a place where the missing man would have been standing before he vanished. None of his friends recognized it. Rangers didn't know what to make of it. They bagged it for the report, though it didn't explain anything. More troubling was the condition of the basin floor. The silt and sand showed no signs of a fall, no slide marks, no depression where someone had stepped heavily. The missing man had been mid-stride. His footprint should have been fresh, clear, obvious, but the divers saw nothing. Search dogs brought in later traced his scent to the waterline, followed it a few feet in, and then stopped. The scent didn't drift downstream. It didn't redirect toward the forest. It simply ended in one spot, the same spot his friends had identified. Rangers expanded the search outward, checking every trail leading away from the waterfall. They interviewed everyone who had been there at the time. Nobody saw him walk out. Nobody heard anything unusual. Nobody noticed a splash. By the end of the day, divers had mapped the entire bowl-shaped basin and the surrounding rock shelves. They found no clothing, no gear, no indication he had slipped, struggled, or moved deeper into the pool. One ranger later said, "He was standing in water barely up to his waist. You don't disappear vertically from that depth without changing the water." But nothing changed. The waterfall case forced investigators to accept another gap, another moment where the environment should have answered the question, but didn't. The next disappearance happened on a canyon trail where water wasn't meant to play any real role at all. The trail was dry, carved into sandstone, with only occasional pockets where rainwater collected. Most hikers passed those spots without even noticing them. But for reasons no one understands, one small puddle became the focal point of an entire search. A man in his mid-40s was hiking alone, but within sight of several other groups. The trail was busy, visibility was excellent, and weather conditions were stable. He carried a small day pack and walked at an easy pace. People behind him said he stopped a few times to take photos of the canyon walls. At one point, he paused near a shallow depression in the rock where a thin layer of water had collected from a recent storm. It wasn't deep, less than an inch, but it reflected light clearly. Witnesses later said he crouched beside it, leaning in slightly, like he was trying to get a closer look at something beneath the surface. One hiker who passed him said the man seemed focused, like he was reading something in the reflection. She didn't think it was strange at the time, but she remembered he didn't respond when she said hello. 2 other hikers rounded a bend and saw him kneeling by the puddle as well. They walked past him, looked back once, saw him still leaning forward, motionless for a moment, as if studying the water. They took a few steps forward, maybe 10 or 12 seconds of walking time. When they turned around again, he was gone. They assumed he'd stood up and moved off the trail, but there was no direction he could have gone without being seen. The canyon walls boxed the trail on one side. The drop-off on the other side was steep but not immediate, and the ledge below was clear and visible. They walked back to where he'd been kneeling. His pack wasn't there. His camera wasn't there. There were no footprints leading off the trail, no scuff marks, no sign he'd slipped, and the thin puddle of water he'd been kneeling beside was completely still. They called out for him, expecting him to appear from around a corner. Nothing. Another group approached and joined the search. Within minutes, someone ran to alert rangers. When the rangers arrived, they checked the puddle first, not because it posed any danger, but because that was his last known point. They found something odd. The water's surface had a circular ripple pattern frozen mid-motion, as if something had disturbed it, but the movement stopped abruptly before spreading outward. A ranger touched the surface with his boot. The ripple vanished instantly. They couldn't recreate the original pattern. This detail wasn't listed in the official report, but multiple rescuers mentioned it off-record. Search teams examined both sides of the trail. The drop-off area was scanned thoroughly. No sign of a fall. The ledge below showed no fresh debris, no disturbed dust, no rolling stones, nothing. If he had fallen, something should have shifted. Helicopters scanned the canyon. Teams combed every switchback. They ran thermals along the rock walls. Nothing. Tracking dogs arrived and immediately picked up his scent on the trail. They followed it to the puddle, right up to the exact point where witnesses saw him kneeling. The dogs circled, backed up, approached the puddle again, then sat down. They didn't track further. They didn't indicate a direction. They acted as though the scent simply stopped existing. Rangers expanded the search zone into the side canyons. They searched drainage paths, checked cracks, caves, ledges. They revisited the trail repeatedly. They interviewed every hiker who had passed him that day. Nobody saw him leave the trail. Nobody heard anything. Nobody saw movement on the cliffside. Nobody saw a fall. Nobody saw a struggle. The detail that bothered investigators most was how narrow the window was. He had been kneeling in clear view of others. There were people behind him and in front of him. He was visible. And yet between one glance and the next, he was gone. Rangers categorized the case as unresolved, unexplained departure from visible area. And the next disappearance would bring the focus back to water. This time, a deep mountain lake, known for clean recoveries, where divers expected an easy search, but instead found a pattern on the lake bed that raised even more questions. The mountain lake where the next disappearance happened is usually considered straightforward for search and rescue. It's deep, but not unpredictable. The water is cold, but clear, and the shoreline is open enough that rangers can track who comes and goes. Recoveries there, when they're needed, normally happen fast. But not in this case. A small group of hikers had reached the lake late in the afternoon. They planned to rest for a while, refill their bottles, and take photos. One man from the group, in his early 40s, walked a short distance away to sit on a flat rock that overlooked the water. The others stayed on the trail section behind him, still within view. He didn't swim, didn't take off his boots, didn't approach the water more than a foot. He simply sat, elbows on his knees, watching the surface. A couple nearby said he seemed calm, just quietly observing the ripples. He wasn't acting strange. He wasn't tired. He wasn't dehydrated. Nothing about his posture suggested distress. What everyone noticed was how still he became after a few minutes, like he was concentrating on something below the surface, even though nothing unusual was visible. One hiker said he leaned slightly forward, almost unnoticeably, then sat back again. His group turned away briefly to sort snacks and water filters. They weren't distracted for long, maybe 10 seconds. When they looked back at the rock, he was no longer sitting there. They assumed he'd walked behind them toward the tree line, but he didn't answer when they called. They walked the immediate area. The trail was visible, open, and empty. They checked the rock again. His footprints were there, shallow impressions in the dusty surface, but no sign he'd stood up and moved in any direction. No prints leading away. No scuff marks. No slide pattern toward the water. Nothing. A ranger happened to be nearby on patrol and responded quickly. He ran a preliminary shoreline check while the group explained what had happened. The ranger said the same thing the others had seen. No disturbance at the water's edge. If the man had slipped or stepped down, the silt and gravel below the surface would have shifted. But the bottom looked untouched. Dive teams were brought in at sunset. They entered from the point closest to the rock, expecting at least some evidence. Instead, they found a perfectly clean lake bed. No clouded water, no fresh marks, no dragged sediment. On the second dive pass, 2 divers reported something strange. A faint pattern on the lake bed. A curved line of slightly darker gravel, about 4 feet long, with a sharp end on one side, as if something had pressed down and released abruptly. It didn't match natural formation or slide patterns. It didn't match foot pressure. It didn't match equipment. When they approached it again later, the pattern looked lighter, as if it was disappearing. They photographed it, logged it, and continued the search. Nothing else showed up. Search dogs traced the man's scent from the trail to the rock. Then it ended. They circled repeatedly, then gave up the trail entirely. Rangers widened the search outward, around the lake, into the woods, across the ridge. But there was no movement, no noise, no witnesses. Rangers checked the logging from the nearby fire tower, hoping a spotter might have seen someone walking the shoreline or climbing toward the ridge. Nothing appeared in the records. The man never showed up in any direction. The case echoed the earlier water-linked disappearances. A moment of stillness, a very small pause, and then a complete break. No direction of travel, no distress, no environmental trigger. The river canyon where the next disappearance occurred is known for steady, predictable currents. Rangers can read that water like a map, where debris collects, where logs turn, where the undertow forms shallow eddies. Nothing about this stretch usually surprises them, but this case did. A couple in their early 40s had been hiking the canyon trail alongside the river. The trail runs high above the water in some places, but there are sections where you can walk right down to the shoreline. They stopped at one of these access points to cool off. The woman sat on a flat boulder near the slope, pulling out a snack, while the man walked closer to the water to rinse his hands and face. He wasn't swimming. He wasn't wading. The water didn't even reach his ankles. He crouched near the edge, cupped water in his palms, and splashed it over his face. His partner could hear him breathing, could hear the water dripping from his hands, could see the back of his shoulders. He said something quiet. She didn't catch what, and leaned a little farther forward. Not dangerously, not in a way that suggested he might lose his balance, just leaning. She glanced down into her bag for a second or two. When she looked back up, he wasn't at the shoreline anymore. At first she thought he'd stood and moved quickly toward the trees behind them, but the slope was open, and she would have seen him. She called his name. No answer. She walked the short stretch of shore, expecting him to appear from behind a rock. There was nothing to hide behind. She started shouting. Other hikers stopped and looked. Many had been close enough to hear them talking earlier. None had seen him walk away. Rangers arrived fast. The shoreline was examined first. His footprints led down the slope and ended exactly where she said he'd crouched. No footprints leading away, no scuff marks from a slip, no signs of a fall. And the water surface was calm. The river in that section is shallow for several yards before deepening. If someone falls in, the bottom shows it. Silt clouds, bent grass, disturbed gravel. But the gravel directly beneath where he'd been crouching was untouched. Searchers began a downstream walkthrough, dragging poles through the deeper sections. Nothing. They repeated the sweep multiple times, widening the search corridor. Still nothing. Divers entered the deeper pockets farther down. The visibility wasn't perfect, but conditions were normal for that river. They expected at least a snagged piece of fabric or some small item. Nothing turned up. Then came the one odd detail that kept bothering the search lead. A piece of driftwood, light, dry, and recently fallen, was found caught in a narrow gap between two rocks far upstream of where it should have drifted. The river current moves consistently downstream. For that piece to end up wedged above the missing man's location made no sense. It hadn't been there during earlier checks. Several hikers confirmed walking past that same rock gap earlier without noticing anything. Rangers documented it, but didn't classify it as evidence. Search dogs were brought in next. They tracked the man's scent down the slope, and then lost it completely at the exact point where he had been crouching. They searched both directions along the bank. Nothing. They checked the trail above. Nothing. The scent didn't resume anywhere. A thermal drone flew overhead during sunset to detect fresh body heat along the riverbanks or among the rocks. It picked up nothing. The canyon walls were too steep for someone to climb unnoticed, and multiple hikers had passed within minutes of his disappearance without seeing or hearing anything. By the second day, rescuers had checked nearly a mile of shoreline, upstream and downstream. They brought in more divers, more dogs, more boats. The conditions didn't change, and no evidence surfaced. The ranger who filed the incident summary wrote a phrase that had appeared in other reports. Last observed location confirmed. No signs of departure. This canyon case matched the others. Clean breaks, calm water. No panic, no noise. The disappearance at the Boardwalk Lake happened on a clear afternoon with crowds everywhere. Families, photographers, birdwatchers, tourists passing through. The lake itself is shallow for a long distance, and the boardwalk runs across the top of it. It's the kind of place where a person is almost never out of view. If someone slips, dozens of people see it. If someone wanders off, they're spotted instantly. That's why this case unsettled the search teams so much. A man in his early 30s had been walking the boardwalk with two friends. They stopped periodically to look at the water. The lake's bottom was visible, light-colored sediment and patches of grass. The man left the boardwalk briefly at one of the designated shore access points. He stepped down onto a sandy strip to kneel and splash water on his hands. This wasn't against the rules. Other visitors were doing the same. His friend stayed on the boardwalk, watching. They said he was joking about how cold the water felt. He knelt for a moment, then stood, brushing his hands on his shorts. He took a few slow steps toward the water again, as if wanting to check something he'd seen beneath the surface. There were at least 20 people within sight of him. One woman on the boardwalk later said she saw him freeze for half a second, like he was focusing on something in front of him. He wasn't afraid or startled, just unusually still. She looked away to talk to her child. When she looked back, he wasn't there anymore. His friends noticed it around the same moment. They assumed he'd stepped behind them onto the boardwalk, but he hadn't. They walked to the access ramp, expecting him to meet them there. He didn't. They scanned the shoreline. Empty. They called his name. No response. People nearby started checking the water. It was clear enough to see straight to the bottom for several feet. There were no footprints leading away, no splash marks, no bubbles. Rangers arrived and started crowd control while others moved into search mode. The shoreline showed his footprints going from the boardwalk to the water. and stopping at the exact point where he'd been kneeling. No return prints, no sideways prints, just an end point. Divers entered from the shallow edge, fanning outward. The bottom was smooth, undisturbed. No sediment plumes, no broken grass, no shifted stones. They expanded the grid, checking deeper pockets even though multiple witnesses insisted he hadn't gone that far. They found nothing. Then a detail emerged from a witness, a small piece of the story that rangers couldn't categorically explain. A woman standing on the far end of the boardwalk said she noticed a strange ripple moving across the surface, not away from the shore, but toward it. The ripples were tight, circular, almost pulsing, and they didn't match the lake's wind pattern. They lasted only a couple seconds and then vanished. She couldn't say they were connected to the disappearance, but the timing aligned exactly. Search dogs were brought in next. They followed the man's scent from the boardwalk down the access ramp onto the sand, and then lost the trail in the same spot where the footprints ended. The dogs tried circling outward but couldn't re-establish the scent. Handlers said it simply stopped. Helicopters scanned the lake from above. The water was clear enough that they could see the darker patches of vegetation and rock. Nothing looked disturbed. Nothing suggested someone had entered or exited. Rangers checked the surrounding boardwalk entries in case he'd walked away unseen. They interviewed dozens of visitors, reviewed phone footage, and searched the tree line. No one captured him leaving. No one saw movement. No one reported a struggle or a slip. By the end of the day, search teams were left with a scene that matched too many others. A person in shallow water, in full daylight, with multiple witnesses and perfect visibility. Gone without transition. The Alpine River disappearance became one of the most discussed among search teams because it happened in full view of a large group. More than a dozen people spread across the shoreline and rafts. Conditions were nearly perfect. Bright light, cold but transparent water, slow current, and a wide gravel bar where everyone had stopped to rest. Nothing about the environment matched a typical high-risk scenario. A group of friends, plus a few strangers from other rafts, were cooling off in a broad, shallow section of the river. Several women, including the one who later vanished, stood waist-deep in the water. They were laughing, splashing each other, passing around water bottles, and complaining about the temperature. Multiple people recalled that the cold made it hard to stay in for long. After a few minutes, the group began heading back toward the gravel bar to warm up. Some were already toweling off. The missing woman, mid-20s, was among the last to leave the water. Witnesses later said she walked normally, talking as she stepped out and onto the stones. Someone handed her a towel. She dried her arms, wrung water from her hair, and stood near the others while they reorganized their gear. Everything about her behavior was normal. She wasn't dizzy, cold, or overwhelmed. She was fully out of the river. Everyone agreed on that. She stood in the same spot for at least 30 seconds, adjusting the strap of her sandal. Then the break happened. A few people turned to lift a cooler back into a raft. Someone else bent down to cinch their life jacket. Another person shouted something from farther up the bar. It wasn't chaotic, just typical group movement. Less than a minute passed. When they looked back, she wasn't standing where she had been seconds earlier. At first they assumed she'd walked up the gravel bar behind them, but the slope was open, and nobody saw her move. Someone thought she might have stepped behind another raft, but the space between them was completely visible. They called her name. No answer. Then they checked the water again, even though she had clearly exited it. But the surface was calm. No splash, no ripples, no movement. Nothing. Rangers were notified immediately. The first responders interviewed witnesses and recreated the last known position. Everyone pointed to the same small patch of gravel near a beached raft. Her sandals left faint impressions there. But after those few steps, there were no further prints. No movement left, right, or back toward the river. Search teams began with the obvious: a water sweep. The river floor was clean gravel, very responsive to disturbance. If someone had re-entered the water, even accidentally, The bottom would have shown clouding or displaced stones. It didn't. They ran a downstream drag in case she'd been pulled in below the surface somehow. But the water wasn't strong enough to take a body unnoticed, and nothing turned up. A diver reported something odd just downstream. A thin ribbon of colder water, distinct from the surrounding flow. Not dangerous, not thermal, just a narrow band of colder current that didn't match the river's usual mixing pattern. When he returned minutes later, it was gone. Search dogs traced her scent from the raft area to the exact spot where she had stood after drying off. Her scent ended there. Not reduced, ended. They tried along the riverbank, checked the woods across the bar, and even scanned the air currents for residual scent drift. Nothing continued. Helicopters scanned up and down the valley. Rafts traveling downstream were stopped and questioned. No one saw anything. The group she'd been with kept repeating the detail that bothered them most. They all saw her step out of the river. She was fully out, drying off, standing in clear view. She didn't slip. She didn't call for help. She didn't walk away. She didn't re-enter the water. She was just gone. Rangers logged the case with the same phrase that had appeared in earlier water-linked disappearances. Subject last observed standing on land. No sign of transition. The kayaker disappearance happened at a remote lake inlet, where the shoreline curves into a quiet, sheltered pocket. The water there is calm, even on windy days, and the sand is soft enough that it records every track, animal, human, even the drag of a paddle. Rangers rely on those tracks because the inlet is narrow and predictable. If someone walks in, their prints show it. If someone falls, the sand and silt reveal the disturbance. A man in his mid-30s had been kayaking alone, but well within sight of several campers on the opposite shore. He wasn't inexperienced. He'd been on that lake multiple times, and the inlet he paddled toward that afternoon was a routine resting point. People often stopped there to stretch, eat, or dip their hands in the cold water. Witnesses from across the lake saw him pull his kayak halfway onto the sand. He stepped out, leaving clear, sharp footprints in the wet shoreline. He removed his gloves, set them on the kayak, and splashed water onto his neck. He wasn't behaving strangely. Calm, steady, relaxed. He bent down, touching the surface like he was checking the temperature or watching something move in the shallows. Then he stood up again and took a few steps along the waterline. His footprints were perfect, deep, defined, evenly spaced. He paused near a piece of submerged driftwood and leaned, as if trying to see something just under the water's surface. 2 campers across the inlet saw that much. They looked down briefly to adjust their gear or wipe their sunglasses. Seconds, not minutes. When they looked back, the kayaker wasn't standing there anymore. His kayak was still on the sand. His gloves still rested on top. His footprints ended exactly where he had been leaning. Beyond that point, the sand was untouched. The campers didn't assume trouble at first. They thought he'd walked behind a rock outcropping or headed toward the tree line. But he didn't respond to calls, and when they hiked around the inlet to check, they found nothing. The shoreline was empty. They alerted rangers immediately. The first ranger at the scene followed the obvious sequence: kayak, gloves, footprints. Then he looked for any sign of a fall into the lake: disturbed silt, cloudy water, bubbles rising, bent vegetation. There was none. The lake surface was completely still. Divers entered the inlet within 2 hours. They worked a tight grid, clearing every section of the bottom. They expected to find the man quickly. The inlet wasn't deep, and visibility was excellent. But the divers reported the same thing seen in other cases. The lakebed looked undisturbed, smooth, flat. No signs of someone stepping or collapsing into it. Then came the one detail that none of the searchers could categorize. Near the submerged driftwood the kayaker had leaned toward, they found a line of tiny, evenly spaced depressions in the silt. Too uniform to be natural, too close together to be footprints, and too shallow to indicate weight. They weren't from fish, weren't from equipment, and didn't match any known animal sign. They formed a short curved pattern, like a half-loop, ending abruptly in clear sand. When divers returned to photograph the marks 15 minutes later, the pattern had faded almost entirely. Not washed away, just softening quickly, as if the silt had risen uniformly from below. The lake wasn't turbulent enough to explain that. Search dogs were flown in and brought by boat to the inlet. They followed the scent from the kayak to the footprints. And again, the scent ended sharply at the last distinct step. They circled the inlet, then the woods above it. Nothing. The scent didn't continue in any direction. Rangers questioned every camper, hiker, and boater within a wide radius. No one saw the man walk into the trees, back into the kayak, or into the water. No one heard a splash or cry. No one saw movement on the shoreline. The kayak remained untouched. The gloves stayed where he'd placed them. The footprints ended at the waterline with no transition. Rangers repeated the shoreline search for 2 full days. Nothing changed. No new evidence appeared. The incident report ended with the same line that has shown up too many times in these water-adjacent disappearances. Last track confirmed. No direction of travel. The River Island case is one that rangers still bring up years later because the physical layout made the disappearance nearly impossible. The island was tiny, more like a large gravel bar in the middle of a slow-moving bend. Visitors could walk its entire perimeter in under 2 minutes. There were no trees, no brush, no places to hide. From every angle, the island was visible from the main shoreline and from the bluff above. A man in his late 20s had come with 2 friends to fish from the island's far side. They crossed the shallow channel easily, the water barely reaching their calves. The island's surface was a mix of stones, packed sand, and patches of softer mud. Their footprints were visible in the wet areas as they walked to the edge. They fished for nearly an hour. The missing man moved around the island, trying different cast angles while the 2 friends stayed in one spot. Nothing about his behavior suggested he was disoriented or tired. He talked normally, pointed out a bird overhead, asked for more bait. At some point, he told his friends he wanted to check the narrow tip of the island where the current broke around a rock line. They could see him the entire time. He walked 10 or 15 yards away, never out of sight, never behind anything. He reached the tip, adjusted his hat, and looked down into the water as if watching something move below the surface. One of his friends glanced away to fix a snagged hook. The other bent down to pick up a dropped lure. It wasn't long, 5 or 6 seconds between both actions. When they looked back toward the tip of the island, the man was no longer there. They assumed at first he'd walked back toward them, but he hadn't. The island had no cover. The shoreline around them was empty. They called his name. No answer. They ran to the tip where he'd been standing. His footprints were clear in the wet sand, a trail leading to the spot. But there were no prints leading away. No footprints circling back. No signs of slipping into the water. The wet sand didn't show a slide pattern or collapse. The river surface was calm. They checked the shallow channel behind the island, expecting at least disturbed silt if he'd re-entered the water. Nothing. Rangers arrived and quickly realized the size of the island made search logistics simple. They walked every inch of it, circling the perimeter, checking the water gradually farther out. They dragged poles through the shallow areas, then deeper ones. Nothing. The divers searched downstream lines. The riverbed near the island was smooth, with occasional gravel pockets, none of which had been disturbed. Visibility wasn't perfect, but good enough that any recent entry would have left a trace. There was no trace. Then came the one anomaly that stood out. A single mark in the mud only a few feet from where the man had been standing. It didn't match a footprint, an animal track, a dragged object, or any familiar shape. It was a long, narrow impression, curved slightly, like something had pressed down and lifted straight up again. Rangers found no second mark, no continuation, no trail. When they stepped away and returned later to re-examine it, the mark had softened in a strange way. The edges blurred faster than normal surface drying could explain. Rangers documented it, but couldn't categorize it. Dogs brought to the island followed the man's scent from the shoreline, across the shallow channel, and onto the island. They followed the scent to the very tip where he'd been standing. And then, again, the scent ended sharply. Nowhere to go. No scent drift. No direction of travel. Helicopters scanned both banks. Rangers checked both upstream and downstream, even though there was no pathway off the island the man could have taken without being seen by his friends. The island remained visible from every direction the entire time. Nobody saw him walk, run, slip, swim, or climb. The friends kept repeating the same thing. He was right there, visible the whole time, standing on land. And still, he was gone. The lakeshore disappearance happened during one of the busiest weekends of the season. Hundreds of people lined the sand and shallow water. Kids played near the shore. Couples sat on towels. Groups cooked on portable grills. Noise levels were high, but visibility was excellent. It was the kind of environment where it's nearly impossible for someone to go unnoticed. A man in his early 40s had come with a larger group. They set up blankets close to the waterline. He walked into the lake several times during the afternoon. Never far, never deep, just enough to cool off or rinse sand from his hands. The lake floor near the shore sloped gently and remained shallow for yards. Anyone standing there could be seen by dozens of people at once. Late in the afternoon, he walked back to the water to rinse off again. Witnesses said he stood in ankle-deep water, leaned forward slightly, cupped water in his hands, and splashed his face. People around him saw the entire movement. Nothing unusual, no sign of distress, no imbalance, no hesitation. He stood upright again, wiped his eyes, and took one half-step backward toward slightly deeper water, still shallow enough that the bottom was clearly visible. A small wave created by boat traffic rippled toward him and broke around his legs. He looked down at the surface and paused for maybe a second. Then several things happened at once. A child screamed in excitement, a dog barked behind a crowd, a group of people laughed loudly. Several witnesses looked away for a moment, all brief distractions. When they looked back, the man was no longer standing in the water. Nobody saw him fall. Nobody heard a splash. Nobody saw movement in any direction. The water was calm. Sunlight hit the lakebed cleanly. He should have been visible. His friends noticed first. They called his name, expecting him to walk back toward them. When he didn't respond, they approached the shoreline. People nearby started checking the water. Someone ran to get a ranger. Rangers arrived quickly and began by confirming the last known point. Footprints were visible in the wet sand leading into the water, but nothing leading out. The surface showed no disturbance. The lakebed directly beneath where he had stood showed no churned sediment, no collapsed footprints, no signs of a fall. The initial thought was that he had stepped backward into deeper water unexpectedly. But the lakebed didn't match that. A misstep always leaves evidence: shifted silt, a new depression, or a drag mark. There were none. Search teams moved into the water, forming a human chain. They scanned the shallow area first. Then they swept deeper. Divers deployed as crowds were pushed back. The lake was clear. Visibility stretched far enough to see unusual shapes or clothing, yet they found nothing. A diver reported the one anomaly of the entire search: a faint spiral-shaped disturbance on the lakebed, not far from where the man had stood. It was shallow, subtle, almost like a twisting pressure had moved the silt in a circular pattern. It wasn't a footprint, wasn't an animal mark, wasn't propeller churn. It lasted only a few minutes and then softened, dissolving back into the sand. They photographed it, but it didn't offer answers. Search dogs arrived later. They followed the man's scent through the sand toward the water, and then lost it at the exact point he'd been standing. They didn't track further into the lake. They didn't move toward the crowd. The scent simply stopped in one place. Helicopters scanned the lake and the woods behind it. Rangers questioned dozens of people. Some had been watching the water the entire time. None had seen him walk away or submerge. None heard anything that suggested a fall. None saw movement. By nightfall, teams expanded the search to the tree line, even though no witness saw him head in that direction. Still nothing. The incident report ended with almost the same wording as the others. Subject visible moments before disappearance. No signs of travel in any direction. No environmental indicators. Across 20 cases, the patterns kept repeating. Clear water, calm conditions, multiple witnesses, and the same silent cutoff point. A person standing in plain sight simply stops being part of the landscape. And every search team walks away with the same question they can't resolve. How does someone vanish next to water without leaving the water disturbed?